Trauma, stigma, and autism. Stigma is a form of trauma. It targets people on the basis of beliefs about them that have nothing to do with who they are. It undermines a person's humanity and overshadows the fullness of their identity by placing assumptions about negatively perceived qualities over openness to their actual personhood. Although trauma is often framed in terms of a terrorizing event, it is the perceived physical and/or psychological threat to our personhood and residual self-protection that underlies much of the suffering involved. Having our humanity threatened, undermined, and devalued is fundamentally traumatic. It can shift us into a hyper-aroused state of defensive safety-seeking or guarded withdrawal and self-isolation. This kind of trauma is experienced as shame. Theologian, philosopher, and counselor John Bradshaw explored shame thoroughly. He distinguished innate shame related to healthy humility and toxic shame, acquired through experiences of abandonment, rejection, blame, and abuse that oppress us into believing our fundamental humanity or true self is defective and flawed. This core of invalidation often stays with a person right into adulthood and creates internalized shame related problems. Autistic individuals often experience the chronic assault of invalidation trauma in the form of stigma, as do many others who don't fit dominant expectations of what people are supposed to be like. Autism, otherness, and invisibility. It is our behavior, communication, and quality of presence that brings the most poignant stigma. We are judged, dismissed, marginalized, rejected, and stereotyped because our actions do not conform to conventional standards, and our social value is diminished accordingly. If the stigma cannot be explained by differences in appearance, orientation, or other identifiable factors, people will start blaming themselves. These are the ones most desperate to find out why they experience stigma and who seek most diligently to better understand what makes them different. It has only been relatively recently that the role of trauma has been explored as a factor in mental health. Trauma can make the challenges of autisticity worse and cause great emotional suffering, yet it may be the most neglected variable of all. This became trauma in the fiber of his being. It manifested itself in the form of dissociation, an inability to be present in the moment when stigma became activated, hypervigilance to rejection, and high levels of physiological arousal triggered by perceived deficits of acceptance. It was feelings of isolation and abandonment during his long recovery. The quality of an individual's life can be significantly impacted by accumulated feelings of perceived exclusion, abandonment, and disrespect. When we experience repeated stigma, judgment, rejection, and/or prejudice because of qualities inherent to our personhood, qualities we may not be able to change or may not have chosen, we may end up experiencing identity fatigue. a form of complex trauma involving chronic assaults on the fullness of our humanity. Chronic invalidation builds up traces of shame, ready to activate when oversensitive safety scanning puts us on physiological high alert to threats that may not logically seem to justify our response. We may be on the lookout for potential sources of further invalidation and defensively protect ourselves with outbursts that make it difficult to function. We may experience sadness and unworthiness that lead to isolating protective measures. Judith Herman discussed the state of chronic humiliation, of feeling unaccepted, how shame can be a physiologically stressful experience, and the role of shame in the development of traumatic disorders. Repeated experiences of stigma related to various forms of invalidation can become emotionally damaging events and a source of distressing complex trauma. Stigma is not just an unpleasant social problem, but a source of personal suffering with life-altering consequences. Awareness of this aspect of stigma should be considered part of the growing sensibility in our culture about the impact of trauma in society. A better understanding of stigma and autism not only provides a unique perspective on the widespread problem of invalidated humanity, but also gives us helpful traction to work with this poignant difficulty. Loosening the grip of shame is possible one step at a time by managing the defensive reactions associated with invalidation trauma. Finding ways to counter everyday stigmatizing processes and reimagine stigmatizing beliefs and assumptions helps create an environment of validating acceptance that nourishes shame resilience. Stigma can be based on visibly apparent things such as skin color, gender, and overt behaviors. It can also come from concealable things like certain forms of physical and mental health, diagnostic labels, sexual preference, socioeconomic status, and religion. Sometimes the most challenging forms of invalidation come from intangible things that are hard to pinpoint but can still be used to determine a person is not one of us. The stigma of autism comes from all three sources and often involves oppressive coercion to conform, as one autistic woman puts it, as if I am only worthy if I behave in a certain way that neurotypicals find acceptable. Certain core challenges we all experience can lead to stigma when our difficulties stand out more than normal. The history of autism is so intertwined with this complex form of oppression. It has become increasingly clear that sensory differences play a central role in the experience of autism for many people with ASD. Each individual has a unique sensory perceptual profile. Both scientific research and first-hand accounts have shown us that sensory issues manifest in numerous ways in the lives of people with ASD, and these issues have consequences for their daily lives. Consider this. If we are anxious or stressed, we may experience our sensory world differently than if we are relaxed and calm. Traumatic sensory experiences may also cause withdrawal or failure to attend, and may cause other effects related to neural overstimulation. Unable to keep up with the rate of incoming information, its threshold for involvement or attention is not great before aversion, diversion, and retaliation responses step in, or plain and simple system shutdowns. Nobody's home. On the various degrees of stress or overload, people can slip out of gear, from the significant back to the literal, or further back to the sensory. When we slip back, we may find ourselves helpless in a system we left behind before we'd mastered it as a usable and cohesive system. When we deny our stories, they define us. When we own our stories, we get to write a brave new ending. Brené Brown. Invalidation, stigma, and trauma. Invalidation is denying or ignoring a person's emotional experience and communicating that their thoughts or feelings are not valid or wrong. Invalidation hurts the most when you feel like people are not listening to you, misunderstanding or minimizing what you are saying, or you feel that you are being ignored. Invalidation as a child or adult can come from family members, teachers, friends, people you work with, or your partner. Invalidation, when used as manipulation by others, can be abusive and lead to damaging effects such as low self-esteem, depression, reliance on others, anxiety, and self-harm. Invalidation trauma happens when we are made to feel worthless, rejected, and devoid of human value. Children whose brains are still developing are particularly vulnerable to this. All children seek validation and emotional attachment from their parents. When they get chronically ignored instead, dismissed, unrecognized, unheard, like just getting eye rolls, rather than responsive affirmation, this can lead to even more damage than more traditionally recognized overt forms of abuse. Persistent invalidation and shame leaves its mark on us. The nervous system sees invalidation as a threat to our existence. It is not a sign of weakness when our body's protective systems kick in, when old hazards are recognized. Such threat recognition is not always conscious and can be triggered by the smallest things. Some people have had abusive, invalidating experiences that make them feel so unsafe they cannot regulate themselves enough to fit in. In extreme cases, the person may be in an ongoing state of defensive arousal, not trust anyone, and be in constant distress. Sometimes this distress lies dormant but gets triggered at unexpected times. The most innocent things can set us off. Anxiety wells up, defensive anger rises to the surface. Although it is hard to overcome the self-loathing that has been planted at our core. Finding supportive, non-judgmental others, we can tap into our spontaneous humanity, which is the most healing way to build resilience to the active scars left by trauma. Although it is hard to overcome the fear and lack of trust that gets built into us. Those who say we should forget and move on do not appreciate the depths of the emotional and psychological scars. People with Asperger's still want connection in their lives. The attraction of the partnership first offers safety, stability, and connection. Quote, chronic invalidation can lead to an oversensitive danger alarm in the body-mind waiting to be activated by the smallest trigger. We have much to learn from autism in this regard because the humanly erosive process of chronic invalidation is constantly at work through stigma and stigmatizing microevents that can make us feel like crawling under a rock, or even aliens on this planet. Whenever conventional beliefs are challenged, there is resistance from society, especially by authoritative experts whose opinions are based on established convention. Feeling judged and dismissed amplifies existing emotional regulation issues, providing a model that illustrates the cycle. Accumulated experiences of invalidation related to abuse, neglect, and stigma, as well as other violating assaults on our personhood, can cause trauma to build up in our body. This leads to heightened safety distress or defensive physiological escalation triggered by the organism's need for safety, which may or may not be conscious. When overactivated, such safety distress can trigger a cascade of difficulties, including emotional escalation and flustering that worsens whatever challenges of autisticity may already be present. Trauma is not always so extreme and is not necessarily related to single catastrophic events. It can also be associated with poverty, harassment, bullying, loss, and chronic invalidation. Trauma can be perpetuated by self-beratement and complicated when it involves repeated exposure over time, such as ongoing abuse, disregard, neglect, and being forced or choosing to endure a toxic or oppressive environment. Such trauma is often referred to as complex trauma. Judith Herman is often credited with first articulating this in her seminal book, Trauma and Recovery. She specifically mentions prolonged terrors such as captivity, child abuse, and spousal abuse as sources of this kind of trauma, and talks about a new diagnosis called complex PTSD. This formulation has not been officially adopted in the DSM. Trauma, Stigma and Autism, Developing Resilience and Loosening the Grip of Shame by Gordon Gates.
So that's it's really, Steve said safety is the treatment, which is a lovely way of thinking about it. And the other day he told me, the body will reorganize when it feels safe. Mm-hmm. So it really is all about bringing that embodied sense of safety, because safety is not about thinking I'm safe. Safety is about an embodied sense in my nervous system bringing me that sense of safety, which is that ventral vagal experience.